Despite promises to cut agricultural subsidies, developed countries still spend over 600 billion annually supporting their farmers. When I first studied about the WTO's agreement in agriculture, it seemed like a breakthrough for fair global trade, but the reality has been far from ideal. Today, we will dive into why this agreement has often failed short of its promises and why developing countries continue to face major challenges in the global agricultural market. One of the main promises of the AOA was improving market access. The idea was straightforward: convert non-tariff barriers like quotas into tariffs, then gradually reducing these tariffs. In theory, this would have opened up markets and created fairer opportunities for agricultural exports from all countries, right? Exactly. The AOA promised to enhance market access by converting quotas and other barriers into transparent tariffs, a process known as tariffication. Then, those tariffs were supposed to be reduced over time. This sounded promising, especially for developing nations and hoped to gain access to larger markets in developed countries. But things didn't go as planned in practice, right? Right. The reality was very different. Many developed countries use dirty tariffication, setting initial tariff rates excessively high, effectively maintaining their market barriers. For instance, after converting its non-tariff barriers, the European Union established high tariffs on dairy products, which kept its markets largely closed to exporters from developing countries. Japan did something similar with rice, setting high base rates to maintain a nearly closed market. So, while these tariffs were technically lowered over time, the starting point was so high that there was very little real change. Exactly. This manipulation of base rates meant that reduction commitments didn't make much of a difference. Instead of creating new market access, the high tariffs have continued to shield domestic agriculture in developed countries from foreign competition. As a result, the original promise of fairer access remains largely unmet, as developing countries struggle to gain market entry under these conditions. That's fascinating. Now, let's talk about other key promises of the AOA. The reduction of trade distorting subsidies. This was supposed to create fairer competition in global agricultural markets, right? Yes, that's correct. The AOA promised to reduce what we call trade distorting domestic support. Essentially, subsidies that artificially lower production costs and give certain countries an unfair advantage. But here's where things get interesting. The agreement created different boxes for categorizing subsidies: amber box for trade distorting subsidies, blue box for production limiting programs, and green box for supposedly non-trade distorting support. I've heard about these boxes, but how did this system actually come into play? Well, what we've seen is quite clever maneuvering by developed countries. Instead of actually reducing their support, they simply shifted subsidies from one box to another. Let me give you a concrete example. India's case is particularly telling. Under WTO rules, India cannot provide support exceeding 10% of production value. The data shows that between 2010 and 2014, India's market price support for rice was calculated at over 70% of production value, leading to accusations of breaching WTO limits. But there's more to those numbers, isn't there? Absolutely. The real issue here is that these calculations use reference prices from the 1980s. Meanwhile, developed countries have maintained massive agricultural subsidies by simply recategorizing them as green box support, which faces no reduction commitments. For instance, the US and EU have managed to maintain high levels of support to their farmers while technically complying with WTO rules. This creates a deeply unfair playing field where developing countries struggle to support their agricultural sectors while developed nations continue to high subsidy levels through creative categorization. Those are striking disparities, but how does this impact farmers on the ground? It has profound real-world implications. Take India's minimum support price system, for example, which is crucial for millions of small farmers' livelihoods. This system faces constant scrutiny and challenges under WTO rules. while developed countries maintain their support through various exceptions and loopholes. The gap between promise and reality couldn't be clearer. So, we've discussed these stark inequalities in the system. But looking forward, is there any hope for change? What solutions might help level this very uneven playing field? There are actually several proposed reforms that could make a real difference. Let me share some specific amendments that developing countries, particularly India, have been pushing for. What kind of amendments are we talking about? One of the most interesting proposals is the creation of what's called a food security box. Think of it as a special category that would exempt developing countries' poverty alleviation and rural development measures from any reduction commitments. But there's more. We are also seeing proposals to address the outdated ways we calculate subsidies. That reference prices you mentioned earlier, right? Exactly. There's a strong push to update how we calculate these subsidies, factoring in inflation and current market conditions. This would give a much more realistic picture of support levels. But perhaps the most practical solution is a proposal to increase what we call de minimis limits for developing countries, essentially giving them more room to support their agricultural sector without breaching WTO rules. These sound like significant changes, but given what we know about the power dynamics in the WTO, is there any real chance of implementing them? That's where it gets interesting. Recently, we have seen a trend that might actually force change. The rise of RTAs, or regional trade agreements, among developing countries. The data shows that these RTAs have increased food trade by about 18 among members, while WTO membership actually decreased food trade by about 16%. This suggests developing countries are finding alternative paths to cooperation. So they're essentially creating their own solutions? Precisely. And this might be what ultimately pushes the WTO to reform. The risk of becoming increasingly irrelevant as developing nations build their own trading networks. But meaningful change will require acknowledging what McMahon, in his 2011 book, The Negotiations for a New Agreement on Agriculture, highlighted. That agricultural trade isn't just about economics, it's about food security, rural development, and environmental protection. These non-trade concerns need to be central to any new agreement and not treated as a secondary issue. It does sound like there's a path forward, even if it's not an easy one. Yes, and that's what gives me hope. The solution exists. We just need the political will to implement them. The future of global agricultural trade depends on creating a system that works for all countries and not just the powerful ones.